Hello and welcome to Media 7. Later in the show we're all about art, but first we'll take it to the banks. When the word bank turns up in the New Zealand news story, the chances are that the description Australian owned will precede it. The Australian banks that own ours come in for some criticism here, but that's put in the shade by the very real anger that many Australians feel towards what they describe as the bastard banks.
Surely there's a bank that cares about us. They can't all be evil, heartless bastards, can they? They don't give a shit if you live or die. They just want your money. Get the message, okay? This is Mr. Angry with a special message for the slow learners. Banks are bastards.
Okay, so it's completely over the top. But this is how many ordinary Australians view their banks. A quick trip to Sydney, and in the middle of that city's financial heart, in what the Aussies call the big end of town, there are the headquarters of the big four banks. They're the very same big banks that run the business over here in God's Own. But passers-by in Martin Place don't seem to have a good word to say about the people who get to play with their money.
Banks are just bastards, they're ripping us off. Banks, they stink.
They don't care about little people much.
I think they're selfish. There's no two ways about it.
Veteran Aussie financial commentator Michael Pascoe reckons that while the banks do get a bad rap, some of it is well deserved.
Well, bank bashing is almost a national sport in Australia, a tradition. There are reasons for it. Before the deregulation of the financial system in the 1980s, banks tended not to give people loans unless they didn't need them. And then after deregulation, they began to charge fees. Australians weren't used to that, and they had another thing to whinge about.
I think we pay an exorbitant amount of fees.
They are being very greedy.
Fees, fees and fees.
Then in the 1990-91 recession, a couple of the banks were in serious trouble and they put their best interests ahead of their customers. They burnt people, and that hasn't been forgotten. And then, well, once you've got a tradition, you stick with it.
Banks suck.
Ordinary punters may badmouth the banks, but the catastrophic collapse of so many international financial institutions has meant that the big four Aussie banks, along with the ASB, which is a New Zealand subsidiary of one of them, now rank among the top 20 safest in the world.
Right now is not the time to complain about profitable banks. The rest of the world wish they had them.
But the questions remain. Just how fair are the banks to their customers, and do they put profit ahead of people?
Simon Pound with that report. Well, is it turning? If you've been following the news this week, you may have noticed a string of stories about those banks, from the extra point we're paying on our mortgages compared to the Aussies, to the apparent export of banking jobs in the recession. So are our media now finally going feral? And if so, is it even a fair cop? Joining us to debate whether the banks are bastards or babes in the woods, Sunday Star Times business editor Tim Hunter, Andrew Campbell of the financial services union FinSec, and Bernard Hickey of interest.co.nz. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Now, Tim, do you think retail banks get a soft ride in our news media, and if so, why would that be?
I think they get a soft ride from some of our news media, particularly TV. Partly that's because financial stories don't make good TV in general. But
you need pictures to make a TV story, right, don't you? And there are no pictures.
But certainly, from our perspective, we get complaints from banks about how we're giving them too hard a time, and can't we write some positive stories from time to time? So they certainly don't perceive that they get an easy ride from us, I don't think.
So there's no room for us to go emulate the Aussies and go a little more feral then?
I don't think more feral would hurt.
Andrew, you seem to have tapped into a certain feeling of that kind with your current campaign. It would be fair to say that the news media is the key part of the campaign you're running at the moment, isn't it? It seems like quite a modern campaign in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to get our message out to as many people as possible and tap into doing two things. One is obviously representing our members and trying to get a good deal for them and stopping offshoring and some of the negative things that banks are doing in that regard. But also, in lieu of a genuine voice for customers, what we're actually finding is that our issues are actually aligning often with customers' issues as well, and that the sort of banks that we think should be operating in New Zealand work for both customers and staff. And so,
what sort of banks are they?
fairer banks, more ethical banks.
Do they exist anywhere?
No, but we're on a crusade to make sure that they do here, and that's what our campaign's about. And so, yep, the media does play a really big part in that. Part of that's actually a reality about labour law in New Zealand as well. The ability for unions to do things like walk out or go on strike is very limited. So we need to find all of the avenues that we can in order for our message to get
and
across.
among the things you've been doing is a radio advertising campaign which contains the line, we all know banks are making billions in profits. Wouldn't it be a problem if they weren't, though? Isn't there? There's a lot of capital tied up in those organisations.
It is true, and it's certainly projected to be true for the next year as well. KPMG came out last week saying that their predictions for the future year, and that's what your report identifies as well. That obviously that we are lucky that we're in a part of the world where the banks have retained profitability, and certainly our goal is not for them to lose profitability. But we're dealing with the situation we're in, which is that in the middle of a recession, our major banks collectively made more than $3 billion. Now that's more, they've got much better books than the government, yet their investment in terms of helping us get out of this recession is virtually minimal. They ran at a million miles an hour away from the one commitment they made at the Job Summit to a shared equity fund. That's been reported on in the last week in terms of the inability of small businesses to access funding. So, we think that they're not doing anywhere near enough with the resources that they have, and actually in the long term it's in their interest that we get out of the recession. One of the reasons that some of their profits are looking a bit shakier at the moment is the fact that their bad debt provisions are increasing, so they'll want to get out of the recession quickly too. They can do something about it.
Now, Bernard, several weeks ago the listener ran with a cover story whose only word of cover line was bankers! ! And I know what we were supposed to think of there. Do you think the tide is turning a little bit in the media? Because I think that was the strongest statement I've seen so far. We're going to see more of it.
I think we are, mostly because with the official cash rate cut last week of 50 basis points, the banks have not passed that on. And people are asking the question, well, hang on a minute, I've got myself a floating mortgage, surely it was supposed to drop when the official cash rate dropped. But, and that will fuel some of that resentment. But there is another story behind that, and some people are digging around and having a look inside the bank's books to find out if they are gouging profits. I did an analysis about 3 weeks ago which showed that all of the banks, except for Kiwibank, surprisingly, we're actually seeing their profits fall from net interest margins, the bit that we're looking at. So the banks, although they look like they're increasing their profits, when you look at it, they aren't, and they have a point to make when they say their overseas funding costs are very high and they can't afford to pass on these official cash rate cuts.
And yet that listener story seemed to highlight new behaviours by the banks that seem to go beyond that. Companies who've been customers in good standing for, in some cases, decades, finding it difficult to get the kind of short-term credit that those businesses need to keep going. There's a real risk here, I think, isn't there?
Essentially, when you borrow from a bank, they control you. That's the fact of it. And you've got to look too at how easy things became in the last 4 or 5 years for many businesses, and that they could borrow whenever they wanted at reasonably easy covenants. And now the banks are understandably tightening up. Now, some would say they're tightening up too much, particularly for some small to medium businesses, and even for some large ones. But New Zealanders should, I think, really understand and thank the banks for not getting involved in the crazy stuff which has killed off many of the biggest banks in America and in Europe, and they're still not out of the woods yet. New Zealanders, I don't think, appreciate how desperate the situation is for many businesses in the UK and the US, where their banks literally have pulled their funding completely. The sort of grief we're seeing here is nothing like the grief people are seeing in the US.
So it could be worse.
Much worse.
Now, Tim, our banks haven't had the big bailouts, but they did get the government guarantee scheme. And something I'm seeing more often in the news now is the idea that there is some corresponding public obligation for them having accepted that guarantee scheme. Do you think there's something in that? And what would that obligation be?
I think there is something in that, but to balance that point, I think it's worth remembering that the purpose of the guarantee was really not so much to protect the banks, it was to protect the bank's customers. So the people who are really benefiting from that are depositors, of the banks. And certainly it is a benefit to the banks that it stopped a run on funds. And I think, but you know, balancing that, I think there is they should feel obliged to look after New Zealanders as a consequence of that.
Andrew, you've taken quite a different view there. You believe that there is something incumbent on the banks for having accepted that guarantee, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to our general point, which is that we think everyone needs to pitch in whichever way they can in order for us all to get out of the recession. And looking at the banks, they are in a strong position to be able to do that. And so part of the reason we think that it's a good reason to put some conditions on those guarantees is that whilst the banks are still profitable, they can keep people in work, so rather than adding to unemployment, that's an obvious condition. That's what we presented to Parliament yesterday.
But isn't this a slippery slope? Once you start imposing that condition, why don't you say, well, you have to charge this interest rate and you have to reduce those fees? Once you get government in there and telling banks what they can and can't do, don't you risk sliding back into the sort of mid-80s Muldoonism that made our banking system so poor back then?
Yeah, but otherwise you risk sliding back into the mid-90s or early 2000s boom-bust optimism, which actually made a lot of those other banks fall over. I mean, one of the things that has happened as a result of the guarantees is that they're returning similar levels of very large profits back to their Australian shareholders. That's income lost to New Zealand.
You find that many of those profits are actually being reinvested in New Zealand. They're not being sent back to Australia.
There's a lot that is not, and the government and the taxpayer is underwriting that. But the reality is, if I can just make this one point, is that the argument that they should just be standalone businesses who should be allowed to do business as usual ignores the fact that them and their contemporaries created the current crisis. And whilst the banks in New Zealand and Australia may not be as much to blame, they are part of a global financial system which needs to clean its act up. And I don't think that there is many New Zealanders who would be looking at them going, oh, actually, keep your $3 billion combined profit, do what you like with it, don't have a part to play in the recovery here, you just go off and do what you like.
And you sought to quantify that with another clever way of getting yourself in the news, I must say. You commissioned a poll. Yeah. What was the question in that poll?
Well, the question we wrote got rejected by UMR. They said it was too leading. So they actually reworked the question and they came up with a question which was, I can't remember exactly, but basically is, in exchange for receiving government support through these guarantee schemes, do you think that the banks should have an obligation to keep people in employment? And people overwhelmingly said yes to that. What
concerns me about this is that we have a news agenda now which is being set by companies, unions, others who drive the agenda with pre-cooked stories, and these polls are what I see as a pre-cooked story. My big concern here is that the mainstream media, I'm talking mostly about newspapers and television and radio, simply do not have the expertise in the journalism staff. I accept the Sunday Star Times, which is doing a fantastic job, by the way, but the rest do not have the expertise to pull some of this stuff apart and to ask the tough questions, not just of the banks, but of the unions and those people who are arguing their case.
Right, we're going to have to come back to that because we're taking a break now. And when we come back, a look at how banks have sold themselves to us.